Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Have you ever wondered why the food on your plate looks, costs, and tastes the way it does? Well, we're unpacking Raj Patel's incredible book, Stuffed and Starved, to visually map out what is basically an invisible battlefield. The answers are hidden by design, but today we're going to expose the whole shebang. We're kicking things off with a massive, mind-boggling contradiction. We live on a planet that produces way more food than at any other point in human history, right? Yet somehow, we have a billion people who are overweight, living at the exact same time as 800 million people who are literally starving. I mean, how on earth can global hunger and massive-scale obesity be symptoms of the exact same problem? Section 1. The Global Food Paradox. To solve this mystery, we've got to look past this whole idea of personal failing and dig into the hidden geography and economics behind our food. Raj Patel's analysis points out something fascinating, if a bit grim. We usually just assume that wealth equals health and poverty equals hunger. Makes sense on the surface, but the system is actually a lot more twisted than that. Whether you're a malnourished child in a São Paulo favela whose body has been metabolically broken down by poverty, or maybe a family living near the US-Mexico border surrounded by ultra-cheap processed food, it's these massive systemic market forces shaping your physical health. It's not just about your individual choices at the checkout line. Take a look at this perfect example of how those market forces play out right in the grocery aisle. Researchers in the UK found that out of 28 branded children's breakfast cereals, 9 of them, 9, are made up of 40% sugar. That is absolutely wild. And it isn't an accident. This recipe is driven 100% by a corporate incentive to prioritize processed profit over, basic nutrition. Sugar is incredibly cheap, it preserves forever, and frankly, it sells like crazy. Which brings us to Section 2, the illusion of choice. We feel totally free when we're cruising down the supermarket aisles, but as we're about to see, our menu is actually being dictated by corporate bottlenecks, not what we actually want or need. Think about apples for a second. You might feel like you've got a ton of options, Fuji, Granny Smith, Gala, but in reality, we only ever see a tiny handful of varieties because they fit some very strict industrial needs. They've got to have pretty unblemished skin, they have to survive being shipped halfway across the world, they need to take well to chemical waxing, and they've got to be tough enough for mechanical harvesting and heavy pesticides. This whole industrial filter just completely blocks out thousands of ancient, super flavorful, and highly nutritious varieties from ever seeing the inside of your local store. Basically, the system is making the choice for you. And honestly, nothing illustrates the absurdity of this hidden price jump quite like coffee. When we track Lawrence Suguya's coffee beans from his farm in Uganda all the way to a consumer in a wealthy country, the squeeze is just brutal. As a farmer, he makes a measly 14 cents per kilo, barely enough to survive. But by the time that exact same kilo hits the consumer checkout, it's $26.40. So you've got to ask yourself, who exactly is pocketing all that money in the middle? Section 3. The Food System Hourglass. Because if there are millions of farmers producing our food and billions of us eating it, we really need to track down who is capturing all this value. It all boils down to a structural concept known as a bottleneck. The entire global food chain is built around this exact idea. It concentrates incredible systemic power right into the hands of a very small group of corporate buyers and sellers. They essentially act as the ultimate gatekeepers. When you visualize it, it's pretty striking. Picture a giant global food hourglass. Up at the wide top, you've got millions of producers working the land. Down at the wide bottom, billions of consumers eating the food. But right there at the narrow waist in the middle, you have this massive concentration of corporate power. Just a tiny handful of food processors and mega retailers get to dictate the terms for everybody else. They turn around and tell the farmers exactly how little they're going to get paid, and then tell us exactly how much we're going to pay at the register, and what we're allowed to eat in the first place. And the macroeconomic data behind this hourglass, it is staggering. Retailers are pulling in roughly $3.5 trillion, trillion with a T. Food processors are sitting on $1.25 trillion, and agrochemical companies are scooping up about $35 billion. All of this immense wealth pools right there in the middle of the hourglass, while the actual farmers at the top are fighting tooth and nail every single day just to survive. Section 4. The fatal price of farming. Because down at that producing end of the hourglass, this extreme market pressure is creating a devastating epidemic. Over in India, stripping away public agricultural support to push for a volatile free market left farmers incredibly vulnerable. The source material highlights this heartbreaking story of Kistaya, a farmer who sank into absolute crushing debt, just trying to drill wells to irrigate his failing crops. With zero safety net and a system that demands constant profit, he tragically ended his own life using the very agricultural pesticide he was sold. It's awful, but it's an acute symptom of a chronic global debt crisis in the farming world.
Now, we have to be super clear here. This is not just happening in the global south. Even in the United States, if you look at the data tracking farm size and concentration since the 1850s, the reality is stark. The sheer number of farms has plummeted, while the size of the few remaining mega farms has absolutely skyrocketed. Independent family farms have just been steadily swallowed up, driven by that same singular motor of crushing debt. It's the exact same market pressure, just playing out in a different geography. Let's look at how this economic squeeze actually compounds when you throw international trade agreements like NAFTA into the mix. When NAFTA hit Mexico, the market was suddenly flooded with highly subsidized U.S. corn. The price of raw Mexican corn plummeted overnight, absolutely destroying the livelihoods of millions of local farmers. But here's the crazy part. The price of consumer tortillas, the basic everyday staple food, actually increased 7 times over. Wait, how does that make any sense? Well, it's because just 2 massive corporate processors controlled 97% of the industrial corn flour market. The bottleneck captured every drop of the profit, while both the farmer and the consumer paid the price.
This shared economic devastation is actually what connects farmers globally. During the World Trade Organization protests in Cancun, a South Korean farmer named Lee Kyung-hae tragically took his own life to protest these exact trade policies. And Mexican campesinos adopted his story as their own. They marched through the streets chanting, "Todos somos Lee," we are Lee. They recognized in real time that the exact same invisible market forces crushing them were crushing farmers all the way over in South Korea.
Section 5. Fighting for the Future. Now, the story doesn't end in despair. These rural communities are not just vanishing quietly into the night, they are getting organized, and they are actively fighting back.
All across the globe, massive social movements like La Via Campesina are uniting to demand fair prices and actual control over their own resources. You've got groups like the KRRS in India building self-reliance with millions of members, or the Brazilian landless rural workers movement, who are literally taking over unused land so they can grow food sustainably. These aren't just your standard protests. These are farmers actively rolling up their sleeves and building alternative, self-reliant food systems totally outside that corporate hourglass.
Back in 2003, over 100,000 peasants packed into Mexico City's Zacatelo. They were protesting policies that had already forced 1.3 million Mexicans off their land. And their core demand was so fundamental. Agricultural products and traditional ways of life have to be treated as a basic human right to live, not just some commodity to be squeezed for corporate profit. As their slogan boldly put it, "We are people of the corn, survivors who refuse to disappear. Countryside, yes, trade, no."
So here is the absolute crucial takeaway. If we want to reclaim our food system, we have to shatter that bottleneck. It requires both the farmers up at the top and the everyday consumers down at the bottom to recognize how they're both being exploited and to start rebuilding direct, equitable relationships. Whether it's supporting local farmers markets or pushing for massive global policy changes, the ultimate goal is to give all of us a deeper, more authentic kind of choice about what we're actually putting into our bodies.
As we look back at this wild paradox, millions starving while a billion are overweight, we really have to confront the architecture of the world we live in. That hourglass, it wasn't a mistake, it was engineered. So we've got to ask ourselves, if this massive, hidden system was built by choices, what choices are we going to make today to rebuild it? I want you to think about that the next time you're wandering down the grocery aisle. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.
Usually when we look at a global crisis, there is this expectation of basic scarcity. Like, if there's a drought, people go thirsty. Or if there's an energy crisis, well, it's because the oil has stopped flowing. There's a comforting logic to it, I guess. A direct cause and effect that we can easily wrap our minds around.
Right. It provides a very clear target for a solution. If you lack the resource, you simply just need to find a way to produce more of it.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of global agriculture and human health, and that comforting logic just completely shatters. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that defies all basic intuition. So welcome to the deep dive, everyone. I know you're listening because you're curious about how the world actually works beneath the surface. And today, we are tackling a staggeringly massive paradox.
It really is a historical anomaly. I mean, truly unprecedented.
Because we are producing more food on this planet right now than at any other time in human history. We are absolutely swimming in calories. Yet we live in a world where roughly 800 million people are facing chronic hunger or actual starvation. And, existing in the exact same timeline, on the exact same planet, over 1 billion people are classified as overweight or obese.
Which means we've crossed this bizarre threshold. We now have more people suffering from the physical consequences of overconsumption than we do people suffering from acute caloric deficit, while massive systemic starvation just persists right alongside it.
Yeah, I keep visualizing this as a playground seesaw, but one that is just fundamentally broken. Picture this massive global seesaw. On one side, it is plummeting into the dirt, right, weighed down by crushing rural poverty, inescapable debt, and literal starvation. On the other side, it's weighed down by this epidemic of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and hyper-processed consumption. But here's the piece that makes it a paradox.
The people in the middle.
Right. The entities standing in the middle, the ones actually operating the fulcrum of this broken seesaw, they are reporting record-breaking, multi-billion-dollar profits year after year.
And the fulcrum is exactly where the focus needs to be today. Because the conventional narrative, the kind of casual commentary you might hear on the news or just around the dinner table, it attempts to isolate those two sides of the seesaw.
Yeah, it treats them as two completely different problems.
Exactly. It frames them as separate crises of individual choice. So if a farmer in the developing world is poor and hungry, well, the narrative often implies maybe a lack of modernization or a weak work ethic. And conversely, if a consumer in a developed nation is overweight, the narrative just blames a lack of willpower or poor lifestyle choices.
It's always placed squarely on the shoulders of the individual. It's always your fault.
Always. But the source material we are examining today dismantles that entirely. The text reveals this hidden, deliberate architecture where these two extremes of mass starvation and mass obesity, they are not distinct, isolated problems. They are actually deeply intertwined symptoms of the exact same underlying mechanism.
And to really map out that mechanism, we are diving into an incredibly ambitious book today. It's called Stuffed and Starved: The Hidden Battle for the World Food System by Raj Patel, which was originally published back in 2007. And the scope of this investigation is vast. I mean, we are going to trace the journey of our food from the sprawling green soy deserts of Brazil to the highly manipulated psychological architecture of modern supermarket aisles.
From the microscopic genetics of a seed all the way to the geopolitical tear gas at global trade protests. It covers so much ground.
It really does. So what is the ultimate goal of the book?
Well, Patel's central mission in this text is to basically force us to confront a highly uncomfortable question. Why are the very people who physically grow and harvest our food the ones who are most likely to be starving, while those who consume it are increasingly stuffed with nutritionally empty, heavily processed options? And, critically, who holds the hidden power orchestrating this dynamic?
Because it doesn't just happen by accident.
Right. As the text argues, a system this universally contradictory does not happen by accident. It is designed.
Now, before we go further, I do want to clarify something for you listening. This text takes a highly critical, distinctly anti-corporate stance on global economics. Our goal today isn't to take a political side or tell you what to believe about capitalism or anything like that. Our mission is to impartially unpack the arguments, the evidence, and the mechanisms Patel presents so you can understand this perspective on the global food web.
And then, of course, we'll critically evaluate where those arguments hold up and where they might fall short. An objective analysis of a highly subjective system.
Exactly. So let's just get right into the core thesis. If this global contradiction isn't just a matter of bad luck, and it's not just lazy people making poor dietary choices, what is the actual engine driving this massive disparity?
The primary argument of Stuffed and Starved is that hunger and overconsumption are connected outcomes of a global food system explicitly designed to prioritize corporate profit over human nourishment. Patel posits that this system is actively shaped by a very specific combination of forces.
Which are?
Concentrated corporate power, rigged global trade rules, supermarket monopolies, and agricultural policies that basically enforce vast inequality.
Okay, I want to challenge that premise right out of the gate, especially thinking about you listening who might be, I don't know, driving to the grocery store right now. When I walk into my local massive supermarket, I don't feel like I'm part of a rigid corporate architecture. I feel like I have endless choices.
Right, you see aisles and aisles of options.
Yeah, I have thousands of distinct products in front of me. I can
Mhm.
buy organic, I can buy gluten-free, I can buy international foods from countries I've never even visited. How is my diet being controlled if I'm the one pushing the cart and making the selections?
The text actually anticipates that exact feeling. Patel refers to this phenomenon as the illusion of choice. To explain the mechanics of this illusion, he asks us to examine the produce aisle, specifically the apples. If you go shopping for apples in a standard North American or European supermarket, how many varieties do you typically see?
Maybe 5 or 6. You've got the Fuji, the Granny Smith,
Yeah.
the Gala, Red Delicious, maybe a Honeycrisp if it's a good day.
5 or 6. Now, we are conditioned to believe that those specific varieties are on the shelf because they are the most delicious or the most nutritious or simply what consumers have demanded. But Patel points out that consumer preference is entirely secondary. Those specific apples are chosen for corporate logistical survivability.
Wait, logistical survivability, you mean how well they travel?
Precisely. Consider the physical journey of that apple. It might be grown in an orchard in South Africa or New Zealand, and it has to end up on a shelf in London or Chicago weeks later. A Red Delicious or a Granny Smith has been genetically selected and cultivated over decades to possess a remarkably thick, tough skin.
So they don't bruise.
Right. They don't bruise easily when they are packed into crates and bounced around in the back of a freight truck for 2,000 miles.
So they are bred for armor, essentially, not for flavor.
They are bred to endure the supply chain. Furthermore, they respond predictably to the chemical pesticides used in massive monoculture orchards, and they take very well to the cosmetic waxing technologies processors use to make them shine under those bright fluorescent lights of the supermarket.
Which is why you don't see those weird, lumpy heritage apples.
Exactly. You will not find ancient, incredibly nutritious, complex-tasting varieties like the Calville Blanc or the Black Oxford on those shelves. Why? Because they bruise. They have a shorter shelf life. They aren't perfectly uniform in shape.
So the menu is curated long before I ever walk into the store. I'm just picking from a pre-approved list of structurally sound commodities.
And the contrast becomes staggering when you walk a few aisles over. While you are restricted to 5 or 6 varieties of raw apples based on shipping logistics, you might have a choice of 50 to 60 different heavily processed, branded breakfast cereals.
Oh, the cereal aisle is overwhelming. It's just a wall of neon colors. The text actually cites a study showing that in the UK, kids are exposed to dozens of branded cereals targeted directly at them, and a significant portion of those are like 40% sugar by weight.
The economic mechanism behind that discrepancy is crucial. There is a massive financial incentive for corporations to dedicate shelf space to those cereals. Raw whole foods have a very low profit margin. You can only charge so much for an apple.
But a box of cereal,
Exactly. If you take cheap subsidized corn or wheat, extrude it into a star shape, coat it in sugar, and put a cartoon character on the box, the profit margin just skyrockets. So the freedom you feel in the supermarket is simply the freedom to choose which highly profitable, heavily processed item you wish to consume within a corporate curated cage.
okay, that makes sense on a structural level today.
Yeah.
But humanity has been farming for over 10,000 years. We didn't always have global supply chains and frosted cornflakes. How did we get here? How did we transition from localized traditional agriculture to this sprawling corporate machine?
To understand the current architecture, the text takes us back into the historical timeline, specifically looking at the legacy of colonialism. There is a fascinating, albeit pretty grim, concept introduced called Cecil Rhodes' conundrum.
Cecil Rhodes, the 19th century British imperialist and mining magnate.
The very same. In the late 1800s, Rhodes was observing the social unrest in England. He saw angry, unemployed workers gathering on street corners, demanding bread and fair wages. Rhodes experienced a profound realization. To avoid bloody worker uprisings and potential civil war at home, the British Empire had to find a way to provide incredibly cheap food to the growing urban working class.
So it wasn't about feeding the poor out of the goodness of his heart. It was counterinsurgency.
It was entirely about self-preservation for the elite class. That fear of the urban poor rebelling became a foundational driver for global food policy. The strategy was to extract cheap agricultural labor and resources from the colonies to keep the working class in the imperial center pacified, fed just enough to keep them working the factories without rioting.
Wow. And the text traces how that colonial mindset didn't disappear. It just kind of evolved. After World War II, during the Cold War, the United States implemented something called the Food for Peace program. Now, on paper, Food for Peace sounds unimpeachable. You're sending surplus grain to starving nations. But the sources revealed the geopolitical leverage hidden inside that grain.
It was a highly calculated strategic tool. The U.S. used food aid to reward political allies and punish nations that leaned toward the Soviet Union or attempted to nationalize their own resources. If you aligned with American interests, you received the subsidized wheat. If you didn't, the spigot was turned off. Food became a literal weapon of foreign policy.
Which sets the stage for what I think is one of the most controversial and pivotal moments in the book's historical analysis, the Green Revolution. Because if you take a standard high school history class, the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s is taught as an unmitigated triumph of human ingenuity.
Right. Norman Borlaug develops these miracle seeds, crop yields explode, and 1 billion people are saved from famine. It's usually presented as purely heroic.
Yeah. And to be clear, the sheer volume of caloric output did increase dramatically, right?
Well, absolutely. The yields were unprecedented. But Patel's analysis asks us to look at the biological and economic mechanics of how those yields were achieved and who ultimately paid the price.
Let's break down those mechanics. What actually made a miracle seed miraculous?
The primary innovation of the Green Revolution was the development of high-yielding varieties, or HYVs, of staple crops like wheat and rice. These plants were selectively bred to have shorter, thicker stalks so they could support a much heavier head of grain without falling over.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here is the catch. These seeds were incredibly delicate. They were essentially high-performance sports cars. They only achieved those massive yields if they were given laboratory-perfect conditions.
Which means they required massive continuous inputs. You couldn't just plant them and rely on the rain like you used to.
Exactly. They required unprecedented amounts of water, which meant drilling deep boreholes for irrigation. They required massive applications of synthetic, petroleum-based chemical fertilizers to stimulate the growth. And because they were planted in vast monocultures, literally miles and miles of the exact same genetic strain, they were highly vulnerable to pests, which meant they required heavy applications of chemical pesticides.
So when the U.S. and global institutions pushed these seeds onto countries like India, they weren't just handing over a solution to hunger. They were handing over a subscription model.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. A subscription model to American agrochemicals. The text outlines how the U.S. government essentially forced nations like India to adopt this entire technological package by tying emergency food aid directly to the purchase of U.S. manufactured fertilizers.
You want the food to stop the famine right now, you have to agree to buy our chemicals forever. That's incredibly coercive.
The ecological and economic devastation was profound. Ecologically, traditional, drought-resistant, highly nutritious local crops were ripped out to plant these endless fields of thirsty wheat and rice. Soil biodiversity just plummeted. But economically, it initiated a cycle of inescapable debt for the farmers.
Because they had to buy everything.
Yeah, right. To participate in the Green Revolution, a small farmer had to take out a loan to buy the patented seeds. Then they needed another loan for the synthetic fertilizer, then another loan to hire a rig to drill a deep well for irrigation.
They were gambling their entire generational livelihood on the hope that the yield would be high enough to pay off the interest on the loans.
And as we will see when we get into the case studies, when the weather failed or the water table dropped or the global price of wheat dipped, the farmer was left holding a catastrophic amount of debt. Patel argues that these technological fixes were deliberately deployed to muffle demands for actual structural political reform.
Right. If the peasants are demanding land redistribution and economic equality, you just hand them a magical, high-yielding seed and say, look, the problem is solved by technology. No need for a revolution.
It pacified the immediate threat of unrest while quietly transferring the wealth of the rural countryside into the hands of multinational chemical and seed corporations. And this extraction was hyper-accelerated in the 1980s and 90s by a massive shift in global economic policy trade liberalization.
This is where we get into the alphabet soup of global finance. The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO. For a lot of people, these institutions feel incredibly abstract. How do they actually impact the dirt on a farm in the global south?
We need to look at the mechanism of something called a structural adjustment policy, or an SAP. Let's say a developing nation in Africa or Latin America falls into a sovereign debt crisis. They can't pay their international lenders. They go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for a bailout to avoid economic collapse.
Because the IMF acts as the lender of last resort.
Yes. But the IMF doesn't just hand over a blank check. The loans are highly conditional. The IMF tells the sovereign government, we will give you the money, but you must structurally adjust your economy to align with free market principles. And in the agricultural sector, that specifically meant dismantling protective marketing boards.
What exactly were those boards doing?
A marketing board was essentially a government-run safety net. It guaranteed a minimum floor price for staple crops. If global market prices crashed, the government board would still buy the grain from the local farmer at a survivable rate, storing the excess in national reserves. It protected the fragile rural economy from the violent swings of global commodity markets.
So it was a buffer. But the IMF saw that as market interference.
The IMF demanded those boards be abolished. They forced nations to sell off their national grain reserves, privatize their water, and remove any tariffs that protected local farmers from foreign imports. The result was that a small, under-resourced farmer in the global south was suddenly stripped of all government support and forced to compete on the open global market.
Which brings us to the visual core of this entire book. If you take away the safety nets and you enforce this chemical dependency, what shape does the global economy actually take? And this is where Patel introduces the concept of the hourglass.
The hourglass figure is perhaps the most vital conceptual tool in the book for understanding the architecture of agricultural inequality. Imagine a standard hourglass. At the very top, the wide expanse, you have millions and millions of individual farmers, agricultural workers, and peasants physically producing the food.
The producers, broad and numerous.
Then at the very bottom of the hourglass, you have billions of consumers who need to eat that food to survive. Another massive, wide expanse.
But the crucial part is the middle.
The narrow waist of the hourglass. Between the millions of producers and the billions of consumers sits a tiny, incredibly concentrated handful of massive transnational corporations. We are talking about the buyers, the processors, the global distributors, and the mega supermarkets. They control the physical and economic bottleneck through which all global food must flow.
And because they control that incredibly narrow gateway, they possess nearly absolute market power. It's almost like a gravity well that sucks the wealth from both directions. They look up at the millions of disparate, unorganized farmers and say, "We are the only entities with the logistical capacity to buy your harvest. Therefore, we dictate the price. And we are going to pay you absolute rock-bottom pennies, barely enough to cover your chemical debts."
And simultaneously, they look down at the billions of consumers and say, "We control the supermarket shelves. If you want to eat, you pay the price we set." They squeeze the farmer, they gouge the consumer, and the margin in between is captured entirely by the corporations in the bottleneck.
The math the text provides to illustrate this bottleneck is staggering. There's a European example from the early 2000s that really stuck with me. You had over 3 million independent farmers at the top of the hourglass, trying to feed roughly 160 million consumers at the bottom. But the actual gatekeepers, the corporate buying desks, making the decisions about what gets bought, what gets shelved, and at what price number, just 110.
Let that sink in. 110 corporate buying desks controlling the economic fate of 3 million farmers and the dietary reality of 160 million people. That is a level of market consolidation that dictates reality. And the financial scale is immense. The text notes retailers turning over trillions of dollars a year, agrochemical industries heading tens of billions in profit. Meanwhile, the actual humans producing the calories are facing bankruptcy.
And when we talk about the humans producing those calories, the text makes a critical point about who specifically is bearing the brunt of this labor. The hidden labor behind cheap food is profoundly gendered.
It is a systemic inequity that often goes completely unmeasured by traditional economics. Women in the global agricultural system bear what Patel calls a triple burden. First, they are doing the grueling physical labor of farming the fields. Second, because the prices paid for their crops are so artificially low due to the bottleneck, they often have to seek off-farm wage labor just to pay the interest on the seed and fertilizer debts.
And third, they are entirely responsible for the unpaid domestic labor gathering water, finding firewood, cooking, and raising the children.
Yet, despite bearing the heaviest workload, the text notes that women routinely receive less pay, have less legal right to own the land they work, and receive far less technological support or equipment than their male counterparts. They are the invisible shock absorbers of the global food system.
To truly grasp the weight of this hourglass and the reality of that triple burden, we can't just talk about statistics and IMF policies. We have to look at the people trapped inside the glass. The book grounds this massive geopolitical architecture in specific, deeply human case studies. Let's trace the journey of a single commodity. Let's look at the coffee supply chain originating in Uganda.
The story of Ugandan coffee is a textbook demonstration of how the bottleneck extracts value. The text introduces us to a farmer named Lawrence Seguya and his neighbors, the Kafaluzi family. They live in the high-altitude, hilly terrain of Uganda. The climate and the steep slopes are perfect for growing high-quality coffee beans, but they are terrible for growing almost anything else.
Which means they don't have the luxury of pivoting. If the price of coffee drops, they can't just switch to growing wheat. They are geographically and economically locked in to this one export crop.
Exactly. Now let's follow the money. The Kafaluzi family harvests their raw green coffee beans. When they sell those beans to a local independent middleman, they receive roughly 14 cents per kilo.
14 cents for a kilogram of coffee.
That middleman transports the beans down the mountain and sells them for 19 cents a kilo to a local milling operation. The text highlights a woman named Mary Goretti who runs one of these small mills. She removes the husks from the beans. She is operating on such razor-thin margins, she can barely keep the electricity on for the machinery. After milling, the beans are bagged and transported to the capital city, Kampala, where they are sold to an export company for 26 cents a kilo.
So the beans have changed hands 3 times, traveled across the country, been processed, and the total value is still only $0.25.
The export company then ships the beans across the globe to Europe. By the time that exact same kilogram of Ugandan coffee arrives at a massive processing facility owned by Nestlé in West London, the commodity price has risen to $1.64.
Okay, this is where the math of the hourglass becomes truly aggressive. What happens to the value of that coffee once it passes through the corporate bottleneck?
Nestlé takes those raw beans, roasts them, freeze-dries them into instant coffee granules, puts them into a branded glass jar, markets it, and places it on a supermarket shelf. When that same kilogram of coffee rolls out the other side as a consumer product, the retail price is $26.40.
It goes from 14 cents in the hands of the farmer to $26.40 in the hands of the consumer. The corporation has captured a markup of nearly 19,000%. I mean, how is that justified?
The corporate justification is that they are providing the value add. They own the intellectual property of the freeze-drying process. They own the branding, the marketing, the logistics network, and the shelf space. Because they have monopolized the processing and distribution tech, they dictate the margins.
Meanwhile, the text points out that the Kafaluzi family, who literally grew the physical product, cannot afford to send their 13 children to school. They can barely afford to buy meat. They survive on subsistence diets of sweet potatoes and beans while fueling the developed world's caffeine habit. That isn't just an inefficient market. That is systemic extraction.
It is, but the consequences of this system aren't just poverty. In some regions, the pressure becomes lethal. We have to discuss the human toll in India, specifically the tragedy that unfolded in Andhra Pradesh, driven by the legacy of the Green Revolution.
The story of Kistaya and his wife Parvati. For anyone listening, I want to warn you, this is an incredibly heavy, tragic case study, but it is essential to understanding the reality of what the book is documenting.
Kistaya was a seasoned, capable farmer, but to survive in the modern agricultural system, he needed water for his cash crops. Because the Green Revolution strains required so much irrigation, the local water tables had been severely depleted. To reach the water, he had to drill deeper.
Which requires capital he didn't have.
Right. So he entered the debt cycle. He took out loans from a formal bank. When that wasn't enough, he was forced to turn to informal, local money lenders who charge exorbitant, predatory interest rates. He used the money to hire a rig to drill a borehole. He struck dry dirt. He borrowed more, drilled a second hole. Dry again. He borrowed even more, drilled a third time. Nothing. He was utterly buried in debt. His crops were failing, and his family's entire legacy was going to be seized.
The psychological weight of that? To know that no amount of hard work can dig you out of a mathematical trap.
The despair was absolute. In August 2004, facing insurmountable debt and the loss of his dignity, Kistaya waited until Parvati and his children were asleep. He took a packet of organophosphate pesticide, a highly toxic chemical called phorate, which ironically is part of the very agrochemical package pushing these farmers into debt. He mixed the toxic powder with water, drank it, and lay down next to his wife. He died beside her in the night.
And the devastation doesn't end with his death. It transfers entirely to Parvati. The text describes how she shaved her head in traditional mourning and was then forced to find whatever casual labor she could just to keep her children alive. She ended up making disposable leaf plates, earning about 50 cents a day simply waiting for her 8-year-old son to grow strong enough to take over the grueling fieldwork.
And we must emphasize, Kasai's suicide is not an isolated anecdote. It is a statistical epidemic. The text cites data showing that in Andhra Pradesh alone, rural suicide rates tied to agricultural debt were hitting thousands of individuals per year. Even in the Punjab region, which was heralded as the crown jewel of the Green Revolution's success, United Nations reports found that over a third of the farmers were facing total economic ruin.
When you trace that level of despair, it really recontextualizes the geopolitical protests we see on the news. Which brings us to the third major case study in the text, and an event that made global headlines, the death of Lee Kyung-hae.
Lee Kyung-hae was not a marginal, uneducated subsistence farmer. He was a highly educated agricultural leader, a former local politician, and a prominent voice in the South Korean peasants' movement. In 2003, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, was holding a major ministerial conference in Cancun, Mexico, to negotiate global trade rules. Lee traveled across the world to protest outside the barricades.
What exactly was he protesting? Like, what had the WTO done to South Korea?
It comes back to the forced opening of markets. Under intense international pressure from bodies like the WTO, South Korea had agreed to open its domestic agricultural markets to foreign imports. This policy shift allowed a massive flood of cheap imported beef from Australia to enter the Korean market.
Now wait, why was Australian beef so much cheaper than beef raised right there in Korea?
Because of the hourglass. Australian beef exports are backed by massive consolidated corporate logistics, economies of scale, and significant government infrastructural support. When that industrial-scale beef flooded into Korea, it completely cratered the domestic price. Lee was a cattle farmer. The sudden drop in prices meant his cattle were essentially worthless on the market.
The text notes that the Korean government told the farmers that the solution to the low prices was simply to increase their efficiency, basically, to expand their herds, which again means taking out more loans.
It's the same trap. Lee expanded, took on the debt, but the market prices stayed flat due to the foreign dumping. He lost his farm. But the collateral damage was much wider. Korean farming communities operated on a system of mutual trust. They had created pyramid scheme borrowing clubs where farmers would act as guarantors for each other's loans. It was a communal safety net.
But if one pillar falls?
The whole structure collapses. When Lee and others defaulted because of the Australian beef influx, it triggered a cascading avalanche of bankruptcy that wiped out entire villages. The social fabric of rural Korea was torn apart by a trade rule written in a boardroom thousands of miles away.
And the despair of watching his community evaporate led Lee to Cancun. He climbed the chain-link fence near the police barricades, wearing a sandwich board sign that read in English, "The WTO kills farmers." He then took out a penknife and stabbed himself in the chest. He died at the hospital a few hours later.
It was a horrific, highly visible act of self-sacrifice designed to force the global elite inside that conference center to acknowledge the literal body count of their free trade policies.
When you hold the stories of Kistaya, Parvathy, and Lee Kyung-hae in your mind, the title of Patel's book stops sounding like a clever piece of wordplay. Stuffed and Starved takes on a very dark, incredibly literal meaning. Let's analyze the duality of that title, starting with the starved aspect.
The starved portion of the title is a direct, literal descriptor of the reality for millions of people trapped at the top of the hourglass. Small farmers, landless agricultural laborers, and the rural poor are physically surrounded by the food they're growing, yet structurally they are starved of the capital required to retain enough of it to feed their own families. They are starved of agency, starved of land rights, and literally starved of calories.
And what about the stuffed side of the equation? Because that operates on a couple of different levels.
It does. On a macroeconomic level, stuffed refers to the corporate entities in the bottleneck, the massive grain traders, the agrochemical giants, the global supermarket chains. They are stuffed with unprecedented monopolistic profits extracted from both ends of the supply chain.
But on a human physical level, it refers to the public health crisis at the bottom of the hourglass.
Exactly. It refers to the billion-plus people dealing with obesity, the proliferation of ultra-processed diets, and the resulting non-communicable diseases like heart disease and diabetes.
And here is where the biology gets incredibly fascinating and deeply tragic. The text points out a cruel metabolic twist. A person can actually be simultaneously starved and stuffed over the course of their life. It's not just rich people getting fat and poor people starving. The poorest demographics are actually suffering from both.
This is a vital scientific and sociological point. The book examines communities of extreme poverty, specifically children growing up in the favelas of São Paulo, Brazil, or in impoverished Mexican towns near the U.S. border. In their early developmental years, these children suffer from acute caloric and nutritional deficits. They are malnourished.
But that early starvation actually breaks their internal machinery, right?
Yes, it alters their metabolic baseline. When a child's body experiences famine, evolutionary biology kicks in. The body literally alters its gene expression to become incredibly efficient at hoarding calories because it believes it is living in an environment of permanent scarcity.
So the metabolism slows down and prepares to store every ounce of energy it can find.
Correct. But then, as they grow older in an urbanizing environment, they're suddenly surrounded by the cheapest calories available on the global market. Hyper-processed, high-sugar, high-fat, nutritionally bankrupt foods. The multinational food companies dump cheap junk food into these impoverished areas.
And when a biologically stunted, calorie-hoarding metabolism meets a diet of cheap refined sugar and seed oils,
The body aggressively stores it as visceral fat. They are stunted by malnutrition early on, which physically programs them to become obese later when exposed to the toxic food environment. The text notes a striking geographical detail regarding Mexico. Obesity rates in Mexican children aren't just correlated with poverty, they are fiercely correlated with geographic proximity to the U.S. border.
the closer you live to the influx of the American ultra-processed food supply chain, the higher the rates of childhood obesity and diabetes. It brings a very dark new meaning to the old political lament. Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States.
It perfectly encapsulates the dual burden. The system creates the scarcity that damages the metabolism and then sells the cheap processed surplus that turns that damage into chronic disease.
So if we have a global architecture that is actively causing mass starvation, mass despair, and mass chronic illness, it begs the ultimate investigative question: who is benefiting? If the system is this thoroughly broken for the people, who is it working for? And that leads us into the text's critique of corporate capitalism. Let's talk about the titans of the bottleneck.
The book offers a scathing, highly detailed critique of corporate concentration. To quantify this, Patel uses a standard economic metric called the CR4, the concentration ratio of the top 4 companies.
Right, it measures market dominance. If you add up the market share of the 4 biggest corporations in any given sector, what percentage of the total market do they control?
And in the agricultural sector, the CR4 numbers are staggering. Whether you are looking at the global trade of grain, the manufacturing of chemical pesticides, the processing of meat, or retail grocery sales, a terrifyingly small number of companies control the vast majority of the volume. For instance, in the United States, the top 4 beef packing corporations routinely control over 80% of the entire market.
See, I always have to stop and reevaluate my basic assumptions when I hear numbers like that. Because the fundamental promise of capitalism, as it's taught in Econ 101, is that it thrives on competition. The free market is supposed to be hundreds of diverse businesses fighting for my dollar by innovating, offering better products, and lowering prices. If that's the natural state of the market, how did it become a monopolized oligarchy?
What Patel deconstructs is the myth that these massive corporations are actually playing by the rules of free market competition. They aren't. They use their initial scale to devour smaller competitors, and then they use their accumulated capital to fundamentally alter the rules of the game to ensure no one else can compete.
I want to use a different analogy here. Instead of a heavyweight boxing match, this feels more like a rigged casino. The corporations are the house. They don't have to rely on having a better product or being luckier than the farmer or the consumer. They literally write the mathematical odds of the games being played on the floor. And the text provides a mind-blowing example of the house getting caught rigging the game. Archer Daniels Midland.
Archer Daniels Midland, or ADM, is one of the largest agricultural processing and commodity trading corporations on the planet. They proudly refer to themselves as the supermarket to the world. But in the 1990s, they were caught by the FBI engaging in a massive, coordinated, global price-fixing conspiracy regarding a vital food and animal feed additive called lysine.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. How does a multinational corporation actually fix a global price?
It wasn't subtle at all. ADM executives were secretly meeting with their top corporate competitors from Japan and South Korea in hotel rooms and conference centers. They literally sat around a table and agreed to divide up the global market share into exact percentages and agreed on the exact price they would all charge for lysine.
So they artificially eliminated the free market. If a buyer went to company A, B, or C looking for a competitive price, They were all secretly charging the exact same artificially inflated rate.
Exactly. They were effectively stealing millions from farmers and consumers by gouging the market in unison. They were eventually caught via FBI wiretaps, and ADM was fined $100 million.
Which sounds like a massive fine, but for a corporation turning over billions, it's basically a parking ticket. It's just factored in as a cost of doing business.
And that is Patel's point. The system actively works to remove competition because competition limits profit. Yet these corporations justify their immense scale to the public and to regulators under the guise of efficiency. They argue that by getting bigger, they can make food cheaper and more abundant. But as the hourglass model shows, that efficiency just funnels the wealth upward into the bottleneck.
Okay, if they are brazenly rigging the market, if they're acting like a cartel, where is the government oversight? Why aren't national governments stepping in to protect their citizens and their farmers? This transitions perfectly into the policy and institutional critique.
This is where we examine the macro architecture of global trade. Patel argues that national governments, particularly in the global south, are often powerless or complicit because the rules of the game are dictated by supranational institutions. We've mentioned the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank.
The architects of the rigged casino.
Exactly. We discussed how structural adjustment policies forced developing nations to strip away protective tariffs and subsidies for their farmers. They were mandated to embrace radical free market capitalism. But the crucial hypocrisy Patel exposes is that the wealthy nations enforcing these rules, specifically the United States and the European Union, completely refuse to play by them.
Right. They force the global south to be a free market, but they run highly protected, heavily subsidized agricultural sectors at home.
The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, provides the clearest example of this double standard in action. Under NAFTA, Mexico was required to open its borders to American agricultural imports, completely removing the tariffs that protected small Mexican maize farmers.
Maize, corn, which has been grown in Mexico for thousands of years. It's the foundational crop of the culture.
And suddenly, millions of small Mexican farmers were forced to compete directly against American corn. But it wasn't a fair fight. The United States government subsidizes its domestic corn and soy farmers to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. That means an American agribusiness can sell its corn on the global market for less than the actual cost of producing it because the U.S. taxpayer is covering the difference.
It's financial doping.
It is. That artificially cheap, subsidized U.S. corn flooded across the border into the Mexican market. The local price of maize collapsed. Millions of Mexican campesinos simply could not compete with the U.S. Treasury. They lost their land, they lost their generational livelihoods, and their rural economies disintegrated.
And this is where the geopolitics gets incredibly dark, because those displaced farmers don't just vanish into thin air. What happens to 1 million Mexican men who suddenly have no way to feed their families?
They are forced to migrate. Their rural economies destroyed by subsidized imports. Millions undertook the dangerous journey to migrate to the United States, desperately seeking low-wage work in American agriculture, meatpacking plants, or construction, just to send remittances back home.
It's a manufactured crisis. The trade policy deliberately destroys the Mexican rural economy, creating a wave of desperate migrant labor, which American corporations then exploit for cheap domestic labor, while American politicians simultaneously use that very same migration wave as a political wedge issue to incite fear.
It is a closed loop of exploitation, engineered by policy.
Hearing about the physical toll on those displaced workers makes you wonder about the daily granular reality for the people caught in this machine. I want to shift our focus from the macro-level trade agreements down to the dirt. Let's look at the human impact, the real physical cost of this artificially cheap food. We've talked about Castilla and Lee, but there are entire communities being hollowed out in ways that sound dystopian.
The book is meticulous, almost relentless, in documenting this suffering. Take the desperation of the landless agricultural workers in India. We discuss suicide, but the need to service agricultural debt takes even more macabre forms. Patel visits a village called Shingnapur in the state of Maharashtra. The farmers there were so deeply indebted from the costs of chemical agriculture that they resorted to a literal biological fire sale.
You're talking about the kidney sale center.
Yes. Entire communities of farmers were selling their own kidneys on the black market to organ brokers just to pay off their loans to the moneylenders. They were so desperate to draw attention to their plight that they set up a formal kidney sale center and invited local politicians to inaugurate it. It was a dark, desperate piece of political theater designed to say, you have taken our crops, you have taken our land, our internal organs are literally the only commodities we have left to sell.
It is the ultimate endpoint of a system that views human beings purely as resources to be extracted. And we see this extraction targeting vulnerable demographics specifically. Let's talk about the series Apple Orchards in South Africa.
This brings us back to the gendered dimension of the hourglass. The series orchards supply massive supermarkets in the UK, like Tesco. The labor required to pick the fruit is intense, seasonal, and precarious. The book highlights the discrepancy in how this labor is treated.
How does it break down between the men and the women?
The male workers, who often handle the machinery or the heavier transport, are provided with essential safety gear boots, overalls provided for free by the company. The women, who are hired as casual labor to pick and sort the fruit, are given nothing. They work in their own clothes, often without proper footwear, exposed to the elements and the pesticide residue.
And the wages.
They are paid an absolute pittance, barely enough to cover basic survival. Patel interviews a female worker named Aruna. She describes a profound, soul-crushing shame. She spends 10 hours a day surrounded by an abundance of beautiful, perfect food destined for Europe. Yet she returns home to a child begging for food, and she describes not having the courage to look people in the eye because she feels she has failed as a mother, despite working herself to the bone.
She is internalizing the failure of a global system.
Exactly. And the human impact at the consumer end of the hourglass is equally insidious, though in a different way. The text explores the concept of toxic food environments and food deserts in urban centers in the US and the UK.
A food desert isn't a place with no food at all. It's a place with no real food.
Right. It's an area almost exclusively poor, marginalized, working-class neighborhoods where it is virtually impossible to purchase fresh produce or healthy ingredients without access to a car. The major supermarket chains flee these areas because the profit margins are higher in the affluent suburbs. They leave behind a landscape dominated exclusively by fast food franchises, liquor stores, and convenience marts selling highly processed, shelf-stable junk.
If you are listening to this right now, think about your own neighborhood. Think about how far you have to travel to find a fresh vegetable versus how far you have to travel to find a neon-colored sports drink or a bag of chips. For millions of people, that radius defines their entire biological reality.
So the urban consumer, particularly children in these demographics, are essentially trapped in an environment structurally designed to make them sick. They are relentlessly targeted by marketing for hypercaloric food, setting them up for a lifetime of chronic illness. And the final cynical layer of this is that the medical, pharmaceutical, and diet industries then gear up to sell them highly profitable treatments for the diseases caused by the food system.
It is a perfectly closed loop of profit extraction. The system makes you sick and then sells you the management of your sickness. Okay, we have laid out a massive, incredibly damning portrait of global capitalism as presented in Stuffed and Starved. It is bleak, it is infuriating, and it is highly persuasive. But as we always do on this audio journey, we need to step back. We need to play devil's advocate and critically evaluate the text itself. Patel is painting with a very broad, very dark brush. Does the argument hold up to scrutiny? Where are the blind spots?
It is essential to maintain an impartial, critical lens. The book has undeniable analytical strengths. Patel is masterful at tracing the physical and economic supply chains. His ability to take a single coffee bean or a soybean and follow it from the hands of a starving farmer through the corporate bottleneck and into the digestive tract of an obese consumer is brilliant journalism. He successfully links abstract macroeconomics to intensely visceral personal tragedies.
But surely the history of global agriculture isn't purely a cartoonish villainy of corporate greed. I want to push back on his total dismissal of the Green Revolution.
And that is exactly where critics of the book focus their attention. Patel's critique of the Green Revolution focuses almost exclusively on the debt traps, the suicides, and the ecological devastation, all of which are real and documented. However, critics, including agricultural economists and historians, point out that he largely minimizes the counterfactual. What would have happened without those high-yielding seeds?
Right. In the 1960s, global populations were exploding, and massive, catastrophic famines were being widely predicted across Asia.
The Green Revolution, despite its heavy chemical costs, undeniably multiplied the sheer volume of calories produced. It did feed billions of people who might otherwise have starved. Even within the text itself, Patel interviews a protesting Indian farmer named Jagdish Papra who admits that when the miracle seeds first arrived in his village, it felt magical. The immediate yield increases were astonishing.
So it's a question of whether the cure was ultimately worse than the disease, or if it was simply a flawed, desperate measure that saved lives in the short term but created a long-term trap.
Precisely. It is a nuanced debate that the book sometimes flattens into an anti-corporate polemic. Furthermore, critics point out that the text places almost the entirety of the blame on Western multinational corporations and global institutions like the WTO. While they are the dominant players, this framing sometimes underplays the agency and often the profound corruption of local governments in the developing world.
The local elites aren't just innocent victims of the IMF.
Exactly. Patel himself briefly notes how the Indian government manipulated its own poverty line statistics to artificially lower the number of people officially classified as starving. Local politicians, regional landlords, and national bureaucrats are often deeply complicit in extracting wealth from their own peasantry.
There's also the critical issue of time. We have to
Mhm.
contextualize when this book was written. It was published in 2007. We're recording this analysis nearly 2 decades later. The world has changed. Is this text dated?
It does miss several massive paradigm shifts simply because of when it was published. It misses the 2008 global financial crash and the subsequent explosion of Wall Street speculation directly on agricultural commodities. It completely misses the rise of the gig economy and modern food delivery apps. Uber Eats, DoorDash, which have created entirely new layers of exploitation and modified consumer eating habits drastically.
And it misses the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and the massive spikes in global food inflation we've experienced over the last few years.
It does, but despite missing those specific events, I would argue that Stuffed and Starved is actually more relevant to our current moment than when it was first published.
How so?
Because Patel's structural analysis reads almost like a series of prophetic warnings that have now fully materialized. The corporate consolidation he warned about in 2007, it has only accelerated. We have even fewer, even larger mega corporations controlling the seed supply and the meatpacking industry today than we did 20 years ago.
And the fragility of the supply chain, that's the thing that really resonates post-pandemic.
Exactly. Patel explicitly points out the sheer fossil fuel dependency of the global food system. He notes the absurdity of expending immense amounts of oil to refrigerate and transport an apple 1,500 miles just so it can look shiny on a supermarket shelf.
Oh.
He recounts how a brief trucker strike over fuel prices in the UK in the year 2000 brought the entire country within hours of running completely out of food in the supermarkets.
Because the supermarkets operate on just-in-time delivery. They don't have massive stock rooms anymore. The trucks are the warehouses.
And we saw that exact inherent fragility exposed globally during the recent supply chain crises. Empty supermarket shelves are no longer a theoretical warning from a radical sociologist. They are a lived reality for the modern consumer.
We also can't ignore the climate change aspect, which the book touches on, but has become the defining crisis of our era. The text mentions the massive Guarani aquifer in South America being rapidly drained to irrigate vast fields of soy, much of which is just ground up to feed factory-farmed livestock.
The water intensity of the modern diet is staggering. As climate change accelerates, bringing unprecedented droughts and unpredictable weather patterns, this high-input, water-heavy, chemically dependent agricultural model is proving to be completely unsustainable. The system is literally running out of cheap gas and clean water.
And the political pressure cooker is exploding. If you look at the news right now, global farmer protests are dominating the headlines. You have farmers marching on New Delhi, tractors blocking major highways in Paris, protests in Berlin.
They are responding to the exact squeeze Patel described. They are being crushed by environmental regulations and rising fuel costs on one side, and relentless corporate price gouging by the supermarket buyers on the other. The hourglass bottleneck has tightened to the breaking point.
So understanding that this book doesn't exist in a vacuum, how does it fit into the broader intellectual conversation about food, society, and economics? What other works does this connect to?
It serves as a vital bridge between several different genres of critique. It connects beautifully to investigative journalism like Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, which Patel references regarding the industrialization of the American diet and the meatpacking industry. But structurally and emotionally, it echoes classic literature, specifically John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath.
I love that connection, because Steinbeck was writing about the exact same mechanisms of displacement and debt during the Dust Bowl. just on a domestic American scale rather than a global one.
Patel actually uses a brilliant quote from Steinbeck to describe the nature of the financial institutions driving this. Steinbeck wrote that banks breathe profits, they eat the interest on the money. If they don't get it, they die the way you die without air. It is a sad thing, but it is so. Patel is showing us the modern, hyper-globalized version of that exact same mechanical apathy.
And crucially, the book shifts the cultural conversation away from individualistic, consumer-level obsessions. The text mentions the Atkins diet, which was a massive fad at the time, pointing out that arguing endlessly over whether carbs or fats are the enemy completely misses the macro-political point.
It elevates the conversation from personal dieting fads to systemic social change. The core issue isn't which celebrity diet book you purchase. The core issue is food justice and public health.
Okay, we've thoroughly diagnosed the disease. We've looked at the broken seesaw, the rigged casino, the hourglass. If the system is this deeply corrupted, what is the alternative? Because we cannot end this deep dive by leaving everyone feeling helpless and depressed. How do we reclaim the system? Let's transition into the solutions.
The alternative framework that Patel champions throughout the book is a growing global movement known as food sovereignty.
Food sovereignty. Define that for us. How is it different from food security?
Food security simply means that people have enough calories to eat regardless of where those calories come from. You could achieve food security by having a mega corporation ship highly processed rations to a population. Food sovereignty is a much more radical democratic concept. It is the assertion that people, local communities, farmers, and citizens should have democratic control over their own food systems. They should have the fundamental right to define their own agricultural, labor, and land policies, free from the dictates of the WTO or transnational monopolies.
What does that actually look like in practice? Does the text provide examples of this working?
It does. The most massive example is an international coalition called La Via Campesina.
The peasant's way.
Yes. It is a staggering global movement representing over 150 million small-scale farmers, landless workers, and indigenous groups worldwide. They actively fight for land rights and agroecological farming methods. Within that coalition, Patel heavily highlights the MST in Brazil, the landless workers movement.
What is their strategy?
Direct action. The MST identifies massive tracts of arable land that are being held unused by wealthy elites for purely speculative purposes. They legally and physically occupy that land, set up encampments, and turn it into highly productive cooperative farming communities. And the text notes that the social outcomes, health metrics, literacy rates, and educational access in these MST settlements vastly exceed the national averages for rural Brazil. They are proving that cooperative, localized agriculture works.
Okay, that is incredibly inspiring for rural land reform. But I have to ask the practical question for the listener living in an apartment in a major city. I can't go occupy a speculative soy farm in Brazil. What are the solutions for the urban consumer trap at the bottom of the hourglass?
The text advocates for actively bypassing the bottleneck. For the urban consumer, that means engaging in community-supported agriculture, or CSAs, and authentic, producer-only farmers markets.
Cutting out the middleman entirely.
Exactly. When you buy directly from the person who grew the food, the money doesn't get siphoned off to a corporate headquarters in another country. It stays within the local economy. The text highlights a fascinating economic metric called the community multiplier effect. Studies have shown that money spent at a localized market gets recycled locally, generating roughly $2.59 of local economic value for every dollar spent.
Whereas a dollar spent at a mega supermarket immediately leaves the community. But wait, I have to challenge this with a very modern trend. What if I just change how I shop at the massive supermarket? What if I only buy the products labeled fair trade or organic or bird-friendly? I go to Whole Foods, I pay a premium for the ethical brand. Isn't consumer demand shifting the corporate behavior?
This is perhaps one of the sharpest, most cynical, and most brilliant critiques in the entire book. Patel explicitly warns against relying on ethical consumerism to save us. He introduces a concept he calls culinary taxidermy.
Culinary taxidermy. That phrase is incredible. Unpack that.
Think about what taxidermy is. You take a dead animal, you stuff it, you pose it, and you pretend it still possesses the vitality of life. Patel argues that when multinational supermarkets sell us fair trade or organic labels, they are doing the exact same thing to social movements.
They're stuffing them.
They are taking the living, breathing, radical demand for social justice and land reform, killing the political threat of it, processing it into a premium-priced marketing label, and selling it back to affluent consumers as a lifestyle choice.
Wow. So when I buy the ethical coffee at the Megamart, I'm just buying the appearance of ethics without actually threatening the power structure of the hourglass.
Precisely. You are paying a premium to alleviate your own guilt, but the bottleneck remains entirely intact. You cannot simply shop your way to a democratic system. True food sovereignty requires structural political change. It requires citizens organizing to demand the end of massive agribusiness subsidies. It requires governments actively enforcing antitrust laws to break up these suffocating corporate monopolies. And it requires redirecting research and funding away from chemical-heavy monocultures and towards sustainable, localized agroecology.
It demands that we stop acting merely as consumers, making choices in an aisle, and start acting as citizens, demanding a just architecture. We have covered a tremendous amount of intellectual and geographical ground today, from the legacy of the British Empire to the coffee mills of Uganda, from the debt traps of the Green Revolution to the psychological marketing of sugary cereal. Let's try to distill this massive investigation down into 5 clear, memorable takeaways for everyone listening. I'll kick us off with number 1. Number 1, hunger and obesity are twins. They are not isolated, individual failures of willpower, laziness, or bad luck. They are dual outcomes of the exact same corporate-driven system, a system that extracts maximum wealth by starving the producers of capital and stuffing the consumers with cheap, hyper-profitable, nutritionally empty calories.
Number 2, the hourglass economy. The global food system is not a free market. It is shaped like an hourglass. Immense power and profit are trapped in the narrow middle bottleneck by a tiny, consolidated cartel of megacorporations. They use their logistical dominance to ruthlessly squeeze both the millions of farmers producing the food and the billions of consumers relying on it.
Number 3, the illusion of choice. When you walk into a modern supermarket, the staggering array of products is a carefully curated illusion. The corporations control the menu. They dictate what we eat based on logistical survivability, aesthetic durability, and maximum profit margins, not on biological nutrition, flavor, or genuine agricultural variety.
Number 4, the human cost is hidden. Behind every artificially cheap commodity in your pantry, whether it's a 99-cent fast food hamburger, a cheap bag of imported coffee, or an out-of-season apple, there is a hidden, invisible trail of unpayable debt, displaced rural labor, exploited female workers, and profound ecological extraction.
And finally, number 5, food sovereignty over consumerism. The ultimate solution to a fundamentally broken food system isn't found by simply buying a more expensive ethical brand at the same Megamart. It requires political action. It's about reclaiming democratic control over our local food systems, supporting localized community agriculture, and actively dismantling the corporate monopolies that hold the hourglass together.
It is about recognizing that changing the wallpaper in the supermarket isn't enough. We have to rebuild the architecture of the building.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, I want to turn directly to you, the listener. I want to leave you with a few provocative questions to carry with you into your week. The next time you walk through the automatic sliding doors of a massive supermarket and you look down that endless, perfectly lit aisle of produce, pause for a second and ask yourself, who is actually benefiting from this incredible layout? And who, somewhere across the globe, paid the invisible, hidden cost for these incredibly low prices? Ask yourself, is your freedom of choice as a consumer at the checkout aisle actually powerful enough to fix a systemic geopolitical crisis? Or is that just what the house wants you to believe? And finally, building on everything we've explored today, but looking out your own window at your own community. What would a truly just, localized food system look like where you live? How can we collectively rethink our definition of agricultural abundance so that no one, anywhere on this planet, ever has to be either stuffed or starved? Think back to the very beginning of this conversation. We talked about diagnosing a global crisis. The picture of our global food system is not clean. It is murky, it is highly complex, and it is deliberately hidden behind layers of corporate PR, subsidized corn, and perfectly waxed apples. But once you see the shape of the hourglass, you can never unsee it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the bright labels, and we will catch you in the next conversation.